Hi, Jenni here, and I've read 11 classics this year. Well, 11 plus 1. And in this video, I will go through all of them and share my thoughts and opinions on them. I have dedicated videos for a few of these, so I will not delve into those as much as others. Why I said 11 plus 1? Well, I think one of these is a modern classic that hasn't been out long enough to be considered a classic, but I just know that one day it will be. And personally, I define classic as a book that is timely and discusses societal issues and phenomena that impact people decades on. It has writing that survives the test of time, and even after decades of release, that there is still something to be said about that book. So that's my definition of a classic. So I'm gonna look through all the classics I've read on Storycraft. These are not in chronological order, which kind of bothers me, but I'll let it be. So first up is Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility. I read this in Finnish, translated by Kersti Juva. I read this with my now fiancé. In the beginning of the year, we've done buddy reads for all of Jane Austen books, and we have a couple of more left. I've read Sense and Sensibility many times before, and I really love this story. It tells the story of two sisters, Eleanor and Marianne Dashwood. They also have a much younger sister, and a brother who has a different mother, but they share a father. Basically, they are in search of marrying because their futures depend on marriage. I must say, Jane Austen is one of my favorite authors and always will be. She has a way of conducting societal themes in stories that doesn't feel like she's giving you a lecture, but rather she examines and discusses those societal themes through these different types of characters that she has come up with. She's very witty and funny and has a way of evoking emotion and causing discussions regarding women's status in society all these years later. So I absolutely love Sense and Sensibility. The other Jane Austen book I read this year was New to Me, which is her very short book of the history of England. And in this short book, she goes through the history of England, through the different kings and queens of history. And this one is very funny. The official title is The History of England by a Partial, Prejudiced and Ignorant Historian. So Jane really lets her voice and wittiness shine through this little book. And yeah, I enjoyed my time with it as well. I also read Persuasion by Jane Austen, another Finnish translation by Kersti Juva. This was a brand new translation, and I talked more about this in a video about Jane Austen specifically, but I love Persuasion so much. The translation was a bit of a letdown because it used two modern concepts and translations for things, but still, every time I read Persuasion, I get something new out of it. Every time I can understand Anne Elliot's despair about having met the love of her life and then listening to other people and letting them persuade her to not go with him, and then ultimately them reuniting again at the end 7 or 8 years later. It's just, I love it so much. Another classic I read was James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain. This is my third James Baldwin, and the book is based on his childhood growing up in a religious community in Harlem. It tells the story of a Johnny who also grows up in a religious community and is striving to become part of that religious community more, but then battles with inner questions and doubts regarding existence and God. And this book happens on one level, and then there are plenty of flashbacks that tell the stories of many of the characters in the book. James Baldwin is one of the greatest authors of all time. Like, the way he writes just deeply impacts my soul, and Go Tell It on the Mountain was no different. I was so thoroughly amazed by it and the narration of it and all the questions he discussed regarding faith and, growing up in the 1930s Harlem and, those difficult familial relationships that people have, like he wants to be a preacher like his father, but there are all kinds of turmoil in that, and it's just such a beautiful, beautiful book, and I highly recommend it to anyone who wants to read historical fiction. Then I read The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton, and the book is a satirical look into the wealthiest of New York society in 1870s, especially into the love triangle between Newland Archer, who is the inheritor of a very wealthy New York family, his wife May Welland, so they are married, but Newland is in love with Ellen Olenska, who is May's cousin, and Ellen Olenska is married to a foreigner, European, wealthy man. I don't remember his title. And yeah, this book really deeply discusses of how societal expectations impact personal relationships and how people do not pursue who they love or what they really want because they want to meet these expectations, because they want to maintain the status quo and be rich. I thought this was a brilliant book as well, and I thought the satirical angle worked really well with this book. I also read Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, and this was much better than I expected it to be. I expected it to be very on the nose, kind of like Orwell's books are. It is the story of a fireman whose job is to burn books, and that books have been demonized and banned altogether, and people's lives have been taken over by these screens that they have at home, and some of them think that they are their family members when they are not. They are just versions of televisions, and it is just this incredible commentary on intellectualism and surveillance, things that are still very much relevant to this day. Again, yeah, this book took me by surprise because I was expecting a very on the nose, look at what they are doing, like type of commentary that doesn't let the reader think for themselves. But it was actually much better than that, and I was just really amazed by it. And by the way, no hate to George Orwell. I just feel like 1984 and Animal Farm both are very on the nose, and they are important and incredible books. But to me, personally, I felt like the author was talking down to the reader, if that makes sense. And I felt like Fahrenheit 451 didn't do that. The next classic I read was Astrid Lindgren's Veljeni Leijonamieli. I think it's Brothers Lionheart, and it is a devastatingly beautiful children's book about two brothers, Jonathan and Karle, at least in Finnish translation, who die when they are young and they end up in Nangiala, which is like the life after death. But things are very chaotic there, and they need to fight for the safety of all people in Nangiala. I first read or listened to this book in my Finnish language lessons in elementary school. I think we listened to the audiobooks, so like on these CDs, if you remember that time. And I remember being very deeply impacted by it, so I wanted to read it as an adult again. And I think the book is full of important lessons about hatred and accepting oneself and fighting for equality, and most importantly about death. The way Astrid Lindgren discusses death is very accessible, and it doesn't mock the child who is reading it, but helps them kind of understand what death is about and what it might be like. So Lola loved this one. I don't read a lot of children's books, but I had to read this one. It's such a huge part of my own childhood, and Astrid Lindgren is such an amazing writer as well. Alright, then I read a Finnish classic, Työmiehen vaimo, which translates to, in English, The Worker's Wife, by Minna Canth. Minna Canth is a very important figure in Finnish history. She fought for equality way before anyone, and in her plays and books she discussed equality and marriage and so on. In this play, the main character Johanna marries Risto, and Risto ends up being a lousy husband. He has trouble with drinking and he drinks away all their money, and they have a child together, and Johanna is just trying to raise their child and maintain their home while Risto just runs around. I think this play has aged really well because even though it's from the 1800s, if I'm correct, 1885, there are still so many aspects to marriage and society and equality between genders that are still so relevant to this day. Alright, and then finally I want to talk about Middlemarch by George Eliot. I have talked about Middlemarch so many times on this channel. I have a whole dedicated video on it, but that book changed my life. It's based on the fictional village or town of Middlemarch, and the main character is Dorothea Brooke, who is orphan and is trying to get married so that she can pursue education like within the realms that are available to her. And also the other main character is Dr. Lydgate, who comes to Middlemarch to become the town's doctor and is also seeking marriage, but they live kind of parallel lives, if that makes sense. While they do not get married, their lives are connected through the town of Middlemarch. Within this book, once again, George Eliot really captures societal commentary, the commentary about equality and women's rights so incredibly well. Yes, it's 900 books, but it was so worth it. And yeah, I have a whole video dedicated to Middlemarch if you want to check that one out. Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, I also read that one this year. It's about Catherine and Heathcliff who grow up together. Heathcliff is kind of taken by Catherine's father off of the street of somewhere in England, and they grow up kind of as siblings and they grow very attached to each other. So while they are very attached to each other, Catherine ends up marrying Linton because Linton is from a much wealthier background. Again, I made a video about Wuthering Heights. I thought it was fine. My expectations going into it were a bit varied because at one perspective I was really excited to finally read this monumental classic, but also I had trouble with the narration, as the book is narrated by a guest at one of Heathcliff's properties, and then further the story is narrated by Nellie, who is Catherine's maid. So following that was a bit difficult, but then I got it as the story went on. Then I read 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. It tells the kind of an origin story of the family Buendia who established the town of Macondo. This one I had mixed feelings about because I could see why this is so important and why it has had such huge impact across the world. But to me, some themes and aspects of it were quite unsettling. Like I said in the video where I discuss this book, of course you can have unsettling themes, but what do they bring to the story is very important as well. And I feel like that's a very thin line, and sometimes it went over to the like, well, I don't understand the purpose of this, you know? But I am really glad to have read it. And finally, I read Sophie Oksanen's Puhdistus. In English, it's Purge. It's a modern book, but I feel like will be a classic one day. It tells the story of Alide True, an Estonian woman who, in the main timeline, is an elderly woman, and suddenly a young woman who is a victim of trafficking shows up to her yard. And then in the second timeline, Alide True is a young woman under Soviet Estonia. This story is very harrowing. Sophie Oksanen's writing is so deeply impactful, and it was devastating, but also very well written. Okay, I have a cold, so my voice is like gone. But yeah, those are some of the classics I read this year. I think this is the most classics I've ever read, so I'm really happy about that. What are your favorite classics? Let me know in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed this video. See you in the next one. Bye!